This is Chatter. I'm Shane Harris. This week, author Damien Lewis on Josephine Baker, singer and spy.
She turns up at these checkpoints and she just gets out of the train carriage, dripping in furs and jewellery, and everyone does a double take. My God, it's Josephine Baker. So the Gestapo agents don't stop her and ask for her papers or search her. They run to fetch their wives and their girlfriends. Come and see, it's Josephine Baker. Come and get your photograph taken. It's that superstar effect. She wandered in her head and her heart. Where could a person like me flee to where we could possibly be free? So actually, she had no choice but to fight. You have to fight for freedom every day. And I think the conflict in Ukraine has brought us alive to that again.
Damien Lewis, welcome to Chatter. Thanks for joining us on the show.
Yeah, it's fabulous to be with you.
Yeah, we really appreciate it. You are in the midst of a book launch. You are a prolific author. How many books have you done now?
Truth be told, I've lost count. And
it's a good problem to have.
And it depends if you count the ones which I've co-authored. Because I do some of that, and I've actually ghostwritten some books as well. So,
right. Well,
I mean, it's dozens would be the answer if you included them all. Yeah.
Very good. Well, we are here to talk about your latest book, Agent Josephine, American Beauty, French Hero, British Spy. Josephine Baker, who is the protagonist of your book, she has fascinated me for a long time. I actually first encountered her story in the HBO movie about her life, which was on years ago, which was a really tremendous film. She is arguably could be one of the most famous people of the 20th century, maybe latter 20th century, however you want to think about it. Our audience may not know everything about Josephine Baker, and this book is not a biography, and you make that very clear. It's a book about her very interesting role she played with the French resistance in World War II and working with British intelligence. But just give us a little bit of a flavor for who she was, for those who might not know, and kind of put her in context of the genuine megastar that she actually was when she was performing in France.
So Josephine was born in St. Louis, grew up in poverty, stealing coal from rail cars with her gang, going to school barefoot, actually pretty much ran away from home and school in her very early teens. And she'd realized, or she'd hoped, or she'd had a sense that she might earn a living by singing and dancing. She had this natural talent. And she made her way to Broadway in New York, knowing that was the only place where she could really, break through. And she did get a place in a Broadway play, and she was relatively successful in New York. But pretty quickly, she realized that because of the Jim Crow laws, because of segregation, she was never going to be able to thrive. And then she was given this offer by an impresario, a theater manager, who was putting on a new show in Paris, about to launch a show called the Revue Negre. And she said to Josephine, I'm going to offer you the lead female role. And so Josephine had heard, the rumors, the reports that in Europe, one as a black female, or a black person generally, one could be relatively free from prejudice. We're not saying it was completely non-existent, but relatively free. And so she took her heart in her hands, boarded this liner, sailed for Paris, and arrived in France, and was wonderfully surprised at how free things seemed. Took on her starring, age 19, took on her starring role in the Revue Negre. Hugely provocative show. It had rave reviews, and it was attacked by others. But very quickly, she took Paris by storm, and then because the show went on tour, she took Europe by storm. So London, Berlin, Vienna, all the major capitals. And by her early 20s, Josephine was, you could even argue the world's first truly global superstar. She was a superstar, almost like the world had never seen. Very quickly, she became the most photographed woman in the world, earning a very significant amount of money. She had the first role as a black female having a lead role in a movie. So she really, all these firsts, and she became an icon. She became an icon for, all those things that Europe wanted and needed, or felt it wanted and needed, this fantastic performer. And I guess, what really set her apart was was this magic, the Josephine Effect. She had this ability to reach out from the stage and touch her audience, making every single person in that audience believe she was singing and dancing just for him or her. And that was really the unique magic that she brought to the stage, and which I think made her so successful.
Yeah, and there's so many elements of her performance that I think now we recognize, of that level of intimacy and that kind of the spectacular nature of her dancing and performance, that it seems like, maybe people have been trying to imitate ever since her, that she really may have been one of the first people ever to, in this kind of a setting of a club, to really go out there to mingle in the audience. I mean, she was mesmerizing for her personality, but she really built that into the act very deliberately.
Absolutely, yeah. No, you're absolutely right. And many performers cite Josephine as their muse, as their inspiration, and so many of them mimic her moves and her dress. But she had her own club in Paris fairly quickly, chez Josephine, and she would do exactly that. She wouldn't just go and mingle with her with her clientele, with the crowd, but she would actually drag them up onto the dance floor. She would get the whole place rocking, and she would do so with charm and humor and quirkiness and cheekiness and all these things that she brought naturally from within herself to her performance and her role. And bear in mind, when she'd always been a lifelong lover of animals, always. So she got in trouble with her mum when she was just, very young, for adopting all the strays and, rats and mice and whatever it might be, and filling the bedroom she shared with all her siblings with them. But she was always a lifelong lover of animals, and she built them into her shows. So she had, Chiquita the cheetah. She had anacondas, monkeys, tamarind. She had a Great Dane called Bonzo, and all of that she built into her stage shows. So, she was a real natural performer who knew how to play to that role that she projected.
Yeah, and she famously would walk around the streets of Paris with Chiquita on a diamond leash, wouldn't she? And became known as she was known for walking around with this predator cat on the streets of Paris, which is just such
Yeah,
a remarkable image.
she was, and kind of like that. That was an image that kind of, I suppose, came to be iconic and bodied Josephine as people saw her. But bear in mind, there was the flip side to Josephine. In her chateau on the outskirts of Paris, she would wander around the gardens in a batter felt cap and a pair of gardening trousers, gathering snails for her pet duck. She was also very down to earth privately, and bear in mind also, because of her upbringing, which was tough as anything, she was a street fighter. And she was a fighter. She was tough as anything. And that comes through in the war. What comes through in the war was this was a woman who was unbreakable.
Yeah. And really in a deep, profound sense of right and wrong and justice, which we'll get into when we get into her career in the war. And you started your career, correct me if I'm wrong, as a war correspondent. You've covered conflict. You've done a lot of books on the military history. How did you come to be interested in Josephine Baker as a subject?
I've written obviously massively about war, and war is very often driven by prejudice, whether that be enmity against the other, whether it be religious prejudice or tribe against tribe or race against race. It so often is, and I've seen a very large amount of that, a great deal of that, and I've experienced it very personally. But my kind of what first piqued my interest about Josephine was I saw somewhere, it could have been social media, I can't remember all the media, somewhere I saw a snippet, a small report about Josephine being a spy during the war. And it just occurred to me, well, how could that be possible? Because spies it's the grey man, the grey woman, the man no one notices, the man who lurks in the shadows. It's impossible. Josephine was so instantly recognizable, so well known. She couldn't step off a train or step out of a motor car or go anywhere without people immediately knowing it was Josephine. So that being the case, how could you possibly ever be a spy? And I thought, well, that can't be true. And then I started digging a little bit and I found out it was true. But then I found out, and this is the thing, then I found out that no one knows, or, you talk to anyone about Josephine Baker, no one knows about her role in the Second World. I thought, well, why does nobody know? I mean, this is this is a mind-blowing story. Surely this has to be told. So, one starts to dig. And the more I dug into the story, the more I realized how incredible her wartime role was. And also what an incredibly important role she played for the Allies. And I think this is a key point because, in France, Josephine she is so well known. She's this celebrated, infinitely famous, iconic figure. Outside of France, in Britain, in the States, she's much less well known. And what emerged from my research was that, and this is why this needs to change in my view, because she was a spy for us, not just for France. She was a spy for Britain and for America, for all of the Allies in freedom's cause, and she did so much. And so we owe her a debt.
So she, even before she becomes an agent for the Allies, she was a target of Nazi propagandists, and she had performed in Germany and performed in Europe, but really seems to become kind of vilified and a target for Goebbels and all of these these in the Nazi regime. Talk a little bit about that and how they tried to paint and portray her.
Yeah, so Josephine went first to Germany, kind of in the early 30s, performing, and she was, she took the country by storm, as she did in so many European countries, performing in Berlin, sellout shows. But she returned there after Hitler's rise to power, and she was supposed to do a tour that lasted many months, and she survived for just 3. And she was so vilified and so attacked and so set upon by the brown shirts and the black shirts and the apologists for Hitler's Nazi credo that she just couldn't take it. And you can understand why. If you read the reports from the time, this was horrific. And so she came to Hitler's attention, but she also she was made an enemy of the Nazi state by the Nazi state. So, as you said, Joseph Goebbels, that the Nazi propaganda minister, issued a pamphlet with Josephine on the front cover. As these are the people who epitomize all the Nazi regime stands against. This is the decadent West. These are the freedoms which we all despise. And so long before the outbreak of the war, imagine being Josephine. She's fought, all her life to be able to be who she was and to be the success she knew she could be and to find the freedom she hungered for. And she found it in France and in Europe. I mean, she had a song composed for her, J'ai des amours, I have 2 loves. One of them was Paris, the other was her home country, America. So she's found all of that. And then suddenly, with the rise of Nazism, she sees the rise of the prospect of all of that being taken away. And if it's taken away, let's be frank about it. Nazi Germany wasn't just about conquering Western Europe. They were coming for America next. They were coming for South America. They were coming for the African continent. This is world dominion under the Nazi creed, and she wondered in her head and her heart, where could a person like me flee to where we could possibly be free? So actually she had no choice but to fight. And what she hungered for, what she didn't know in the run up to the war, was how she might do so.
So she has this powerful incentive, and as you put it, I think very well, this need. I mean, the Nazis are coming, and they've singled out her, but they've also clearly they're coming for this homeland that has adopted her and embraced her. So the French get the idea to approach her and talk about making this incredibly famous, well-known person a secret operative, which is a contradiction in the idea. So talk about that French approach to Baker.
Tell me about it. I mean, that's what drew me into the story. So, okay, take a step back. So, France and Britain, the intelligence services of both nations, working very closely in the run up to the war. They know France will fall. This is an extraordinary thing. The French and British intelligence services knew France would not stand against the onslaught. There were 2 reasons for that. One, the French mindset was defensive. It was the Maginot Line. It was, there was nothing in there which accommodated the modern form of fast lightning blitzkrieg war that the Germans were perfecting. And the second reason was because the German propaganda, and I think we tend to forget this, was so good, and there was so much of it, and was so accomplished, that the French people kind of didn't really believe they were coming, so that they just weren't prepared. Their heart wasn't in it. And the Nazi propaganda was, look, why would we invade Western Europe? We're here to fight communism. We're going to move on the east. Of course we're not coming for you guys. And it had worked in France, certainly. So the French and British intelligence services knew France would fall. And they had warned their political taskmasters. They'd warned those in power who did not want to hear, because the First World War was fresh in people's memories, although it was several, all those years ago, and the millions who had died, and no one could countenance another war against the old enemy. And so the intelligence services of both nations were woefully underfunded and woefully understaffed. And so the French response to that was to recruit, and it was the same in Britain as well, was to recruit what they called honourable correspondents. And these were freelance, voluntary, DIY spies, people who would spy, carry out espionage because of love of their country and love of freedom. And someone suggested Josephine. It was not a popular suggestion. This was within the Deuxième Bureau, the French counter-espionage service. And it wasn't popular because, at that time, this was the kind of spirit of the day, and certainly of the intelligence world. They believed that women did not make good agents. And more to the point, they feared, and I paraphrase, but this is what they said. She would be like one of those narrow showbiz personalities who, at the first hint of danger, will shatter like glass. And so, an individual called Captain Jacques Abte, who worked on the German desk, a long-standing Deuxième Bureau agent, was tasked to go and speak to Josephine. He didn't want to go. He says, waste of time. No point me going. And eventually his boss, Colonel Paul Pelol, another long-standing agent of the Deuxième Bureau, said, no, please go. Just give it a try. So he drove out there, absolutely, completely without hope, and turned up at Josephine's chateau, spied Josephine in the bushes, and she emerged wearing her battered felt gardening hat and just her gardening clothes and rusty tin can full of snails, feed to her ducks. And this is not what I was expecting. This is not Josephine in a ball gown, glittering in jewels with her diamond-studded leash, cheetah. This is, he was kind of struck dumb. And she said, come into the chateau, took him into the living room, and they sat by the fire. And that's when Jacques Abte was treated to an up-close and personal bout of the Josephine Effect. I mean, imagine that. He gets it right in his face. She captivates him, and he suddenly realizes why she's such an amazing superstar. And and it's magnetic, and he is captivated, and he thinks in his head, my gosh, if we can harness that power to the world of espionage, she will be an unbeatable agent. There's no one she can't seduce and extract secrets from. And so, obviously they have to make some small talk. You can't just say, hey, do you want to be a spy? You've got to kind of try and sound the person out. But eventually he pops the question and says, look, I guess I'm here to try and recruit you for the French intelligence services. And she says, and again I paraphrase, but it's words to the effect, France and Paris have made me all I am, and I will give this country and the cause my life. And so and he says to her, then you're one of us, you're one of the brothers, you've just joined. And he gives her first mission.
It's amazing. It's such a counterintuitive idea, and as you've pointed out, to get someone this famous to do the job. But I love this idea that he sees her essentially performing. I mean, being herself, obviously. Yes. Speaking, from the heart about her devotion to France and her willingness to fight. But at the same time, this adaptive personality that she has, that she can be the woman gathering the snails and sit there in the front of the fire and seduce you. I mean, these are qualities that are prized in any intelligence operative. And it's just so fascinating that the light bulb kind of goes off for him there. But it's still a huge risk to take there, isn't it? I mean, they must know going in, this could go spectacularly badly.
Yeah, of course they do. And, bear in mind, the first mission kind of almost does and almost doesn't blow up in Abte's face. So, he tasks Josephine. Well, the task comes from on high, obviously, but he gives it to her. He's her handler, if you like. And he says, look, London and Paris are desperate to know what the intention of the Italians is should Nazi Germany declare war, because obviously no one knew. I mean, obviously Mussolini was a fascist, so but Italy had not declared its intention, so it was crucial that London and France knew. And so they said, Josephine, can you find out? And the reason that she had a special reason to be able to do that was because she toured Italy as part of her shows, and she'd gone down a storm, but more importantly, she'd actually befriended Mussolini. odd friendship, but that's what she'd done. And so she was feted, not just by the Italian people, but at the Italian embassies and high society. So she had a complete way of getting into the Italian embassy in Paris. And that's why Jack Apte gives her this first mission, this test mission, I guess. And a week later, she calls him up. And of course, she can't say anything, revealing over the phone for obvious reasons. The Germans were listening to the French and vice versa. So she says, we need to meet. And so they meet in central Paris with Josephine driving her Delage luxury car upholstered in snakeskin, and he gets in and she starts to tell him what she's found out, but she's hyper excited. And because she's so excited, she's like driving very badly and almost causes an accident. And a French policeman stops the car to arrest her, thinking she's a drunk driver. Then he realizes it's Josephine, so he lets her go with a caution. And Abte's thinking, well, on the one hand, she's delivered because she said, look, not only does Italy intend to join a Nazi Germany in the war as the Axis, but they've already signed a deal to do so. This is done and dusted. So on the one hand, she's delivered spectacular, which she's got out of the Italian embassy attaché, the defense attaché, by seducing him either intellectually or physically or both. We don't know. But on the other hand, he's thinking, can I ever control and, shape and train this rookie agent to harness that wonderful quality she has for the Allied cause? And he doesn't know. So yeah, you're right. It's high risk, high reward.
One thing I wonder too, in particularly in that story as well, about what might make her such an effective agent is that, oftentimes, I think it's human nature. When we're around spectacular people or famous people or very grand ones, we often, we want to impress them. We want to ingratiate ourselves with them. The fact that people might want to tell Josephine Baker something about the intentions of Italy joining the Axis, that's a very sensitive piece of information. But I think when somebody believes that this is like, well, me telling someone really important about this, that it redounds to their credibility and benefit, does it?
Yeah, absolutely. And, if you read the kind of contemporary accounts about that mission, Josephine gets that information out of him by provoking him.
Mm-hmm.
I think probably by saying, don't you know? A man in your position, surely you must know this. You're not telling me, Mario, that you don't know. It's that kind of slightly flirtatious, provocative, challenging the man's ego in his position. You're absolutely right. But it's interesting. I had the manuscript read by a couple of friends of mine who were former intelligence people, both in the States and over here in the UK. And I just did that because I wanted their feedback. And a couple of them said to me, the best agents are always those who have been forged in fire. They are always those individuals who've had, at some stage in their life, a really tough time because they've learnt resilience. They've learnt to walk into the fire time after time and not be daunted. They've learnt what it means to confront their demons and their fears and get through that and come out the other side. Well, Josephine had that in absolute spadefuls. You could not really imagine much of a worse and tough upbringing as hers. The race riots in St. Louis, which she witnessed, and all the rest of it. So she had these multiple reasons why, when you understand that her stardom was her cloak and her dagger, she hid in plain sight. She was herself and only herself, and that's why she had such an impact as an agent. And when you couple that to her upbringing and then her ability and her experience and her skill as a performer to be all things to all people when she had to be, you can understand why when they drew her into their circles. And this is one of the things that really kind of just blew me away about the story. So Jacques Capet recruits her. He's the teacher, she's the pupil. Very quickly, that relationship becomes upended, and eventually she's off doing solo missions herself because he doesn't have the ability to travel, because he just doesn't have the Josephine cover that she has, and he's left back in at their base, kind of filing the intelligence and doing the backroom stuff. So yeah, she really, you could almost she's almost made for this, and the war is for Josephine, in my view, and this is why I wanted to write the book. Actually, is where she finds herself.
Mm.
You can be a superstar. You can be a great world-beating performer. It doesn't mean you found yourself. It doesn't mean you found your reason for living, your cause, your raison d'être. Josephine found it in the war.
And and you write about how she wasn't only performing as an intelligence agent. I mean, she was doing other tasks too. She took in refugees. She was a pilot and flew aid missions. Talk about some of the other ways you found that she dedicated herself to, to service in the war and other ways that she could.
Yeah, so before Nazi Germany invaded France and took Paris, and obviously at which stage she had to flee, she got her pilot's license before the war because she'd married a Jewish French industrialist called Jean Lyon, and he had taught her to fly. In fact, he proposed to her in the air. He proposed marriage to her in the air. So she was, and unlike a lot of superstars, she didn't have a pilot fly her places. She flew herself to places. And so when war broke out, and there were, long before Nazi Germany invaded Poland or Czechoslovakia before that, or the Low Countries, there were hundreds of thousands of refugees and dispossessed and victims fleeing Nazi Germany, because these were the people the Nazis were there to oppress. So the Jews, homosexuals, people of color, left wing people with left wing views. The score. Mm-hmm. And so Western Europe was already flooded with refugees long before Nazi Germany actually invaded. And so Josephine not only flew missions in her little light aircraft to take aid to those fleeing refugees, which also, of course, doubled as spying missions because it was perfect cover for aerial reconnaissance, But she also started working as a volunteer in the refugee centers in Paris. And look, yes, Josephine could take soup around to people. That wasn't the point. This was the point. So you have, thousands of refugees gathered in Paris. Josephine turns up and they all go, oh my gosh, it's Josephine Baker. And suddenly those traumatized old people and babies and young kids and mothers have a smile on their face. And she sings for them. Imagine that. I mean, that's extraordinary. That's the Josephine effect again. It's just manifesting itself in another aspect of the war, and one that she absolutely dedicated herself to. And then, of course, she was also going and performing for the troops along the Maginot Line, to bolster the morale of French, British, and other nationalities manning the defences who were getting, during the phony war, who were bored and homesick. And Josephine came there, and she was a breath of home. She was their sweetheart for a night.
And it really, that reminded me too of, you had, in the U.S. you had actors who joined up in the cause for, boosting morale. And, famously, there was the club in Los Angeles, I think, where, stars would dance with the troops. I mean, there really was a sense at this time, it seems to me, of famous people using their celebrity and trying to channel it into, the war effort. But I'm not aware of many people taking the level of personal risk that she did. I mean, had she been found out as an agent, I don't know that her fame and celebrity would have saved her. No?
Not at all. No. If Josephine had been caught, she almost was caught several times over. They came for her. So in the summer of 1940, after she's fled Paris, she flees to the Dordogne, to her chateau there, Chateau des Melons. And she starts to, she rustles together a makeshift resistance cell. It's like, Jewish refugees, some former Deuxième Bureau agents, some former French military guys, but none of them know how to fight. None of them know what to do. No one even knows the meaning of resistance. No one even knows if the French people will resist. Then they hear General de Gaulle's call to arms, of course, in early summer 1940. And then Churchill very quickly thereafter, in his schoolboy but workable French, gives his call to arms. And they think, well, okay, there are people who are going to fight, for freedom, and not just the freedom of France, but the freedom of the world. And so Josephine starts to gather her troops, and they get weapons and they hide them in the cellars of the chateau, and they put a wireless transmitter in the roof, and they're starting to organize. And then she gets denounced by someone in the local community, presumably, and the Armistice Commission, which was the German body set up to police the armistice, the peace deal. Well, peace deal. It wasn't a peace deal. You know what I mean? France's deal with Germany, post the invasion. So the Armistice Commission turn up, and the Armistice Commission is peopled by, German soldiers, but also Gestapo and SS. And this jack-booted colonel, walks up the steps of the chateau, and his soldiers have surrounded it. And he strides into the library. And bear in mind, in the library, just a few minutes before she got the warning they were coming, she was meeting 2 Deuxième Bureau agents who had just turned up with a load of weapons, but more importantly, with a load of top secret intelligence from Colonel Paylol, because the French intelligence service had gone underground and was still gathering intelligence. And with the utter cool, the icy cool that it's extraordinary when you read that scene, that episode. The colonel comes in, and obviously he expects to strike the fear of what, God or the devil into her. And quite the opposite. She basically says, "What are you doing here in my chateau?" And he's like, "Well, you've been denounced." And she says, "You choose to believe the denouncers." And he's trying to get the upper hand, and she outwits him at every stage. And eventually, and he's thinking in his mind, well, if she was hiding weapons here and intelligence and resistance fighters, she wouldn't behave like this. She's provoking me. And eventually he says, "Well, do I even get a cup of coffee?" And she says, "We have no coffee." And do you know why? And I'm paraphrasing. She says, "Do you know why we have no coffee? Because you have invaded our country illegally. If you leave, we can probably get some coffee back. And then, yes, I would offer you a cup of coffee." I mean, she's unrepentant, rebellious, and icy cold towards him. And eventually he leaves thinking, well, I think we've probably got it wrong. I mean, that's not the way someone who was guilty would behave. There's no fear there. That's just one example of when she is very close to getting unmasked. And if she had been unmasked, we have to be honest with ourselves. Death is the best thing that could have happened to her, because the Gestapo and the SS had appalling and terrible ways of treating people who they saw, as enemies of the Nazi state, and they made no distinction between men and women. In fact, they would use a woman's feminineness against her in ways we can imagine to really torture their soul. And many, many female agents were treated in the most despicable, appalling ways, and eventually, murdered horribly. That's what Josephine would have faced, and she knew it.
It also strikes me that as she's hearing that story of this, this imperious Nazi officer coming into her home and thinking he's going to, absolutely have her quivering, there is that performer again. It is the woman who is able to walk into an audience of strangers, and in that case, seduce them and fill them with joy, but then bring them under her spell and control them and get them up on a stage dancing with her. And it's that same kind of instinct, that same kind of force that she turned it the other way to repel this guy, but she was leading him, not the other way around.
Absolutely. That's absolutely, she's the boss. And, it's that combined with one other factor about Josephine, which really, kind of grabbed me right at the start of researching the story and made me think we got to tell it, because a lot of people have said to me, well, why didn't she just, Germany invades France, France falls, Paris is about to fall. Most Americans queue at the American embassy, they get a visa, they go home. They're citizens of a neutral nation, they all mostly go home. Not all, but most. Why didn't Josephine do the same? She was a superstar, an American superstar. Josephine could not, and it's because of what we talked about earlier. She had seen personally what Nazi Germany was going to bring, what they stood for, and she could not turn away. She could not turn aside. It's that absolute belief in her cause being right and just, and that there was no other alternative. That this was night and day, evil against good. That also gave her that strength to stand against that colonel and others at other times and say, you are here illegally. You get out of my chateau. You shouldn't even be in this country. And it's an incredible thing that at many stages throughout the war, all those professional agents, long-standing agents who she served alongside, most of whom are male, most of whom are French or British, but then Americans too, many of them, if not all of them, at some stage lose heart. Because let's be frank about it, right way through to, you could argue, late 1943, it looked as if Nazi Germany was going to win. And at every stage, any one of them expressed their doubts or their worries, she would say to them, what are you talking about? America will join this war. And when America joins this war, you do not know what my people are capable of. You don't know what Americans can do. We will win. And she never once wavered. Maybe she did privately in her quiet moments, but certainly not when anybody else was around, and certainly not when she knew that bolstering the morale of those of her fellow agents was absolutely crucial.
You know, I in my job as a journalist, I've been covering very intensively the war in Ukraine and talking to a good number of Ukrainian officers as well. And I couldn't help but finding comparisons between their kind of relentless spirit of optimism and perseverance. I mean, I know Ukrainians who've been telling me since the beginning, we're going to win. And my thinking like, okay, well, I'm not going to contradict you, but like, I don't know that you are. But there was something about this. I mean, it's kind of I don't want to call it just sort of like a blind optimism. It's on some level, it's a deeply rooted faith that like, no, we are stronger than they are. We can do this. We can summon something. And I think that for someone like her to be a performer, to have succeeded against all of the odds as a Black woman, as a foreigner when she comes to France. I mean, it seems like she just had boundless resolve, and it never really dried up during the war. It was just kind of always there.
You're absolutely right. You know, part of me wanted to call the book, unbreakable, because she was unbreakable. And that's another thing people have said to me, you know, when they're reading the book, why doesn't she step away at some stage? You know, because these repeated back-to-back espionage missions she then does, very often solo, increasingly on her own, increasingly exposed. You know, imagine the psychological toll and the toll that takes on you physically of these repeated back-to-back missions. And she gets so sick, and she is so often on death's door. People have said, why didn't she just step away? I've done 3 years, I've done enough. I've done 4 years, I've done enough. I've done 2 years, I've done enough. I'm going back to America to recover. She never does. She is there when the troops march into Berlin. She's been with them on the front line, getting shelled and attacked by warplanes on the front line, performing with the troops all the way into liberating Europe and into Nazi Germany itself. And then she remains behind afterwards to perform in the concentration camps for the victims of the Holocaust. It's absolutely remarkable, that unbreakable spirit. And yes, I'm really glad you brought up the parallel with Ukraine, because I've talked about it a lot already, you know, about this book. And you see those scenes, you know, I've reported from war. You see those scenes. They are so reminiscent of the Second World War. Those cities shelled to ruins. You know, this is brutal, bloody, despicable stuff. And you see a free and democratic country being steamrolled, or the attempt to steamroller it by a much more military capable aggressor for no other reason than they don't want it to be there. And it's a reminder, if we ever needed it, which we do, I think, that the freedoms we cherish, or we should cherish, needs to be fought for. It needs to be fought for every day. So what Josephine was fighting back then, we need to remember these are still freedoms that we should cherish and fight for today. And, you know, yeah, absolutely. I was writing this book, you know, at the end, as the Ukraine war kind of broke out and was on our horizon. And yeah, but the Ukrainians' belief that they are right and they will prevail resonates very strongly.
And it strikes me there's another parallel too of, you know, Josephine Baker and President Zelensky. I mean, performers understand something about, they understand how to play to an audience. They understand how to communicate succinctly, but also very deeply. I don't know that. Josephine Baker was serving in a clandestine role, obviously, so this was a bit different. But you know, it strikes me that even with President Zelensky, people doubted him in the beginning because they think, well, he's just a comic. I mean, he's a performer, right? But it's that ability, that talent, and we should know this from people like Ronald Reagan and others who have had a background in performing, that allows them to break through and become rousing, to become symbolic, to know how to behave iconically if that's what they need to do, and you can't separate that from the performer. They the performer is is very much in the forefront in that kind of role.
Yeah, absolutely. So so Josephine ends up in North Africa, in Casablanca, and she does this incredible role there with Jacques Abte gathering intelligence, largely for America now. Well, America and Britain in preparation for the Torch landings, where biggest amphibious landing in the war yet before D-Day in American and British forces into North Africa to liberate Southern Europe. And she gets very, very sick. And when Morocco is liberated, or American troops on the streets, British troops on the streets, she's still very sick. And the American and British generals approach her and ask her to do a performance for the troops. And she thinks, I don't even know if I'm capable. She's still very weak and very ill, but she girders her loins and decides to do so. That first show it's epic. Doesn't sing for long, she's too weak, but it's epic. And the American generals in particular think, my gosh, if we can have her, performing for the troops all the way across North Africa, all the way into Europe, we're going to win. So they approach her with a contract, and it's an exclusive contract to perform for American troops until the end of the war. And she says no. And she says no because, one, I will not perform just for Americans. I will perform for any troop fighting in the Allied cause, whatever their nationality, French, British, German, Austrian, Polish, whoever. That's what I have to do. And she says, two, I will never get paid. So she's never, ever paid at any stage throughout the war for all the work she does. And she uses her own money to such an extent to fund her activities that by the end of the war, she's pretty much bankrupt. In fact, she's not just funding her own activities. She's also taking this money, buying coal and food and whatever the war destitute need, and just taking it into places where there are people who have nothing and giving it away to them. And also getting Jews out of Europe and then getting them visas and paying the bribes to get them to South America in safety. So, and in that role that she then increasingly performs, kind of late 43 through to the end of the war, it's a dual role. So she's performing now, but she's also gathering intelligence, and she does it brilliantly. But during that period, she becomes increasingly this iconic figure that is, as I say, right on the front line. Time she's on the stage and, the German warplanes swoop down and she's there with the troops in the dirt, taking cover, trying to eat a sandwich. There's a Texan soldier crawls across with a bowl of ice cream and says, Miss Baker, you've got to have your dessert, under fire. It's crazy stuff. And at one stage, somebody says to her, it's in Europe and it's the winter of 44, 45, and there's snow on the ground. It's freezing cold. And she's performing outside, in this freezing cold in her, very, very, scant, ball gowns and dresses. And someone says to her, you shouldn't be here. And she says, listen, I'm a soldier too.
Yeah, and it seems she really embraced that role and being one of them. Talk a bit about the role she played for British intelligence. I mean, she's obviously deeply involved in the French resistance, but what was her value and her function as an agent for the British?
So, months before the outbreak of the war, the Secret Intelligence Service spy master in Paris, who's this amazing, incredible figure, almost unknown, called Commander Wilfred Biffy Dunderdale. Biffy was his nickname. Biffy boxing. He was a very good boxer at school. He was the liaison between the Secret Intelligence Service in London and the French Intelligence Service, working hand in hand. And before the war, and they know France will fall, and they know once France falls, there will be no means to get intelligence from France to London. So they need a way to reopen that bridge. And before the war, it's mooted that perhaps Josephine can be the courier, the person to take whatever intelligence is gathered through. And then, of course, the fall of France is so precipitate. No one saw it happening in 4 weeks. Everyone is blindsided. There are trucks crammed full of the files of the WWII Bureau with all the names of their agents and sources, and they on roads crammed with refugees, and the Germans are capturing material, and it's absolute chaos. And Josephine is at her chateau, in the dawn, wondering what on earth she can do. And Jacques Abte turns up and he says, Josephine, we have a mission for you. It's come from Colonel Pelol, the head of the German desk in the WWII Bureau, who's now obviously gathering intelligence like many French intelligence operatives underground. So, under the eyes of the Nazis, but secretly. He says, we need to take all of the intelligence that's been gathered between the fall of France in June 1940 and now it's kind of September 1940 to Britain. We need a way to get it there. And the way we think we can get it there is you, Josephine Baker, organise a series of shows in Lisbon, the capital of neutral Portugal. And then in your tour trunks, because you have to travel with dozens of tour trunks through your performing costumes and all your stage material and all your musical scores, and in there we'll hide all this material. And some of it I will transcribe on your musical sheets in invisible ink, but much of it will have to go as raw intelligence. So that's photographs of the German landing craft. That's signals intercepts of the Luftwaffe. That's all the list of the Nazi agents which have been sent to Britain. That's all the details of the Luftwaffe air bases from where they're flying the Battle of Britain and Blitz sorties. That's details of Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Great Britain. That's the plans to invade Gibraltar. I mean, the list goes on. And that's your mission. And she said, yep, fair enough. And so she organises these tours to Lisbon. That posters of Josephine Baker, the performer, are all over Lisbon. The shows are selling out, and they set off. They set off to re-establish, not just to carry all of this intelligence, but to re-establish the bridge between France and Great Britain in terms of intelligence. Give you an idea of how crucial that was. Just after the fall of France, Churchill he's only just come to power, calls together his intelligence chiefs and says, look, France has gone dark. We have nothing. We have not a single agent. We have not a single source. We have not a single wireless transmitter. They're poised to invade. They're already starting flying their sorties for the Battle of Britain. Get me back into France. And the other side of the channel, Colonel Paylol is saying to Josephine, it's all gone dark. We need contact with London. Get all of this material, take it to London by whatever means you can, and get that link re-established. And in Lisbon, at the British Embassy, there's a secret intelligence service cell. So if she can get the material to Lisbon and they can get it into the hands of the British Embassy to that cell, from there it can be flown to London. And so that's the mission that she sets out to execute in October 1940 with Jacques Abde, just the two of them, and all her tour trunks, by train and then by air, crossing, any number of checkpoints, Gestapo checkpoints, customs checkpoints, borders, on, the mission of a lifetime, a mission that has war-changing, ramifications.
And we can only imagine. Maybe she didn't feel acute levels of anxiety. Maybe Jacques Abde did. The cargo that they're carrying. Putting aside what would have happened to them personally if they were intercepted, as you vividly portray this cargo, it was essential that it get to this point. This is not just a risky mission; it's a vital one, and it must have been extraordinary knowing that she's everywhere she goes. People are watching her. It is the opposite of a secret courier.
Absolutely.
She's like the most famous woman in the world.
The most famous woman in the world carrying the most crucial intelligence in the world. It's kind of crazy, amazing. But what happens and it's kind of, you've got to read it to believe it. But what happens is she turns up at these checkpoints, and in a way it's like almost laughable, but she turns up at these checkpoints and she just gets out of the train carriage dripping in furs and jewelry and the smile and the Josephine effect, and everyone does a double take. My God, it's Josephine Baker. So the Gestapo agents don't stop her and ask for her papers or search her. They run to fetch their wives and their girlfriends. Come and see Josephine Baker. Come and get your photograph taken. It's that superstar effect. And at no stage, even when they have to board the plane in Madrid to fly on to Lisbon, at no stage are they stopped and searched. Because at every single point, she delivers. And, if she'd faltered, if she'd lost her nerve, if fear had got the better of her, of course, the facade would have all fallen apart, but she doesn't. And that's just the start of, any number of missions where she uses herself, her status to win through.
And one of the sweetest ironies of this is, of course, she's completely fooling these Nazis whose regime have held her out as this villain, this other, and in the most awful ways. And she's completely pulling one over on them because they're seduced by her celebrity too.
Yeah,
Did she
absolutely.
ever reflect on that and looking back? I mean, did she like savor how she just had one up them and gotten the better of them?
Do you know what? At the end of the war, I'm pretty certain it's Jack Abte says to her, this is when the war's won. I think it's like, autumn 1945. He says to her, would you have killed Germans if you had to? And she says, Germans, no. Nazis, yes. So she's tough. This is a tough woman, right? Her greatest rival prior to the war in Paris was Miss Tinguet, the French female star, not a star to the level of Josephine, but a big star in France. And one day she's invited to a film premiere. Josephine isn't. Miss Tinguet's there. Miss Tinguet sees her across the room and says, words to the effect, come, and I don't like to use the word because it's such an appalling word. Perhaps I won't use it. She says, come down and bow down before me, you. And you can imagine the word she says. Yeah, sure. It's a word we all understand.
Yeah.
An epithet and Josephine walks across to her and rakes her face with her nails and says something equally destroying in exchange. She was a street fighter.
Yeah.
And she'd learnt that growing up in St. Louis.
Yeah.
And she was, there was this steel inside her, which meant that when, I'll give you another example. This is kind of like possibly even more powerful. She's in Casablanca in North Africa. And so after the Lisbon mission, Josephine goes back into France on her own because Dunderdale in London, they've got all the intelligence. Dunderdale's delighted, sends a telegram, and they want to go to London to meet General de Gaulle, the leader of the Free French. And Dunderdale says, no, I need you back in France. You need to get this intelligence pipeline flowing properly. So Josephine says, it's fair enough, and she flies back in. And then because it's a safer route, they route the pipeline by early 1941 from France to Casablanca in North Africa and onwards to Lisbon. Okay, and so she's there, and suddenly the pipeline shuts down, and suddenly all their contact with all their intelligence operatives, Dunderdale in London, Paylon in France, they're just completely closed, and they can't understand why, and so they're stuck with nothing to do. And eventually, Josephine turns on Jacques Abte, her, not just her intelligence partner, but they became lovers too. And she says, and I paraphrase, but it's words to effect, and like a cheetah, you coward. You're happy to sit here and do nothing whilst the Nazis are triumphant everywhere. You coward, you useless man. And she turns on him and she says, I'm going off on my own. I'm going to go to Spain and I'm going to go to Portugal and I'm going to find out what's happened and I'm going to get us back in business. And off she goes. And he says to her, no, don't do that. You can't go on your own. You know what will happen to you in Spain and Portugal. You know the fact that we are in this situation means that something bad has gone wrong. You can't go. And she ignores him completely. And she goes and she pulls it off. So yeah, she was tough.
And she never really stopped being a justice warrior. I mean, she's one of the only two women, I think, who speaks at the March on Washington, the famous Civil Rights March. She becomes an activist. So she famously adopts, I think, 12 children and from all different nationalities and backgrounds. But it seems like the end of her life, I mean, it's very punishing. I mean, she's broke essentially. I mean, she doesn't go off into this kind of gilded retirement. Talk a bit about her life after the war and the way that she kind of kept fighting. And I don't know if you have thoughts on, why didn't she sort of go back to turning the celebrity into sort of the money machine and focusing on maybe building wealth, which presumably she might have been able to do and be more comfortable.
Yeah, well, I mean, whenever Josephine was interviewed after the war, and right to her dying day, in fact, she died on the stage pretty much. I mean, she was performing, and she went out as she wanted to go out dancing and singing. And even that last show, the war was a central part of it. But whenever she was asked, what are you most proud of in life, she'd always say the war years, because that's what made me who I am today. That's when she found herself. But after the war, she does go back to performing. She does make a lot of money, but she also invests a very large amount of money in her vision, in her new vision, which is this vision of peace and equality. And basically, she's ahead of her time. She's ahead of her time. Even during the war, I'll give you an example because it's so powerful. I told you that story about when the Americans asked her to do that performance in Casablanca with the troops. She says, yes, but with one caveat. They will not be segregated. Because, the American troops have turned up in North Africa and everybody who's in Morocco is like, what's going on? There are black units and white units, and apparently never the twain will meet. And, Josephine's shocked, but, Jacques Capet says, I thought we were fighting the Nazis to stop this kind of segregation, and Josephine says sagely, wisely. There was a part of Josephine that was very, very, very wise. Says, look, yes, this needs addressing, but first we have to concentrate on fighting the Nazi threat. So let's get that done, and then we'll get this done. But she says to the American commanders, I'll perform. I'll go wherever you want me to go. Frontline, doesn't matter. I'll perform. All across North Africa, she tours in battered old jeeps, risking life and limb time and time again. But she says, I will not perform to segregated audiences. And often that gets people's backs up. So she was ahead of her time, way, way, way ahead of her time. So when she plows so much of her resources into her vision immediately after the war, she is ahead of her time, and it often doesn't land well. And that's pretty much, the root cause of her penury towards, late 60s, early 70s. Of course, she kind of turns it around. I mean, her last show, which was supposed to be her comeback show at the Babino, is sellout, rave reviews and all the rest of it. But that's when she dies halfway through the performance. She passes away. So, it's a bittersweet ending. And the guy who was a dancer in that show, or in many shows, but was there as well, a guy called Jean-Pierre Reggiori, who's French but lives in the States, lives in New York now, and who's been really helpful with my research. He said, Josephine, in that show, the things she would talk about most and with most pride were the war years. Never went away.
And it must have been, on some level, tremendous fun. Terribly, it's frightening, but also just it's such a grand adventure, as it was for so many people who were involved in the war effort. I do want to ask you too about, your own career. How did you make the transition from journalist to book author, and what is it about the subjects that you've kind of returned to again and again that keeps you coming back to them?
I was forced to stop being a war reporter. So I had spinal surgery about 20 years ago. So I almost died. Extremely lucky to be alive. Extremely lucky to not be in a wheelchair. Just being honest. So I could not really go back to being a war reporter. And I had to stop for a year. And during that period, I kind of woke up and realized how many times I had, pretty much almost, not come back from war. So, I stopped. But I kind of believe that if you're going to write about war, you have to have experienced it. So I can sit down with anyone who's been in war, whether it be on, a refugee through to a soldier or anyone in between, and not only can I just understand what they're talking about, but I can feel it because I've kind of seen it and been there myself. I wasn't really, when I was reporting from conflict, I used to concentrate mostly on what conflict did to the innocent people, not bang bang as they call it. Of course I was on front lines, but that was more what I was there for. So I think I take that experience into what I write about. And I like to think that all the stories I write have that unifying thread, which is that I think after decades and decades and decades of peace and freedom, we forget what it is. We forget why it's precious. And we only remember why it's precious when someone starts to take it away from us, or when it's about to be taken away from us, or when someone threatens to take it away from us, or when we see something like Ukraine happening. And then we remember. And when we see the people of Ukraine fighting and dying for the freedoms that we take so easily, these are powerful reminders. So those lessons that we should have learned from the Second World War, you know, we I don't think we have, and I think we need to keep reminding ourselves, and telling these stories is really vital. Yeah, and there's one other reason why I think Josephine's story is so important as well. So many people of color, Africans, Indians, you name it, fought in the Second World War. Millions of them. In the British Army alone, the Commonwealth forces, there were millions. The forgotten army that liberated Burma was a polyglot army. Indians, West Africans, East Africans, and we haven't told enough of those stories. And so it's good that I think the time is right for us to start doing so. So for all those reasons, I think I take that war experience and I kind of filter it into what I write about now. And I know from sitting down with lots of, whether it be World War II veterans through to more modern veterans, and talking to them about their experiences, I know that I can kind of get on the level with them. And I think that's crucial.
And what are your thoughts? I mean, as we see what's happening in Ukraine now, and obviously there's been this just tremendous counteroffensive in recent days by the Ukrainians, and there's a lot of hope and a lot of optimism for what the future might hold, and potentially even what amounts to a Ukrainian victory. But as someone who's covered war, I mean, give us your thoughts just briefly about what the Russian invasion has meant, and how this has, reshaped or even upended, the security of architecture of Europe that has prevailed for, arguably since the end of the Second World War.
Well, no one would have wished for the Ukraine war, and it's had terrible consequences for so many Ukrainians, and we're feeling the economic and social hardship, across Europe, and I'm sure you are in States. So that's all terrible, obviously, and the Ukrainian fight is ongoing, and I'm humbled by the way they are resisting, but I think it has woken Europe up. Certainly in Europe, it's woken Europe up. It's made people realize we could have these freedoms taken away. We have to be willing to fight for this stuff. I'll repeat that. We have to be willing to fight for this stuff. So many people said at the end of the Second War and after the Second World War, so many people who knew so much, had experienced so much, and were so, what's the right word, had so much authenticity. You have to fight for freedom every day. The war's over, but the battle's not over. And I think the conflict in Ukraine has brought us alive to that again. It's tragic that it requires something like that to do so, but I think that's one of the kind of positives that comes out of it. It's tough to be positive when the war's still raging and terrible things are happening, and we're feeling the seismic shocks of it all across Europe and across the world. But I think that is a positive to come out of it, or I hope so.
And as you've finished spending all this time thinking and writing about Josephine Baker, is there anyone today that reminds you of her? I mean, does she have a comparable person as a performer, as an activist, as both, or have we not seen her lights since?
I mean, Josephine's pretty unique. I was doing an interview yesterday with an LA radio show, and it's a black LA radio show, and the lady, interviewer presenter said, "Josephine is my hero." Josephine is my hero. That's how she started the show. She said, "She's my hero, but I never knew anything about her World War II years. I'm so glad you've written this book." And you come across so many entertainers today who see her as their icon and their inspiration and their muse. She was the first, really, and it's not surprising that there have been so many people, and to this day there are so many entertainers and performers who see her as their inspiration. So I think all those people who do so are carrying the torch, and they're carrying forward her work and her legacy, and that's a wonderful thing. And if nothing else, if this book can give them more ammunition to carry forward that legacy, more reasons to do so. Josephine was just elevated to the Pantheon in France. She was pantheonized. It's the highest honor in the French nation. There is nothing greater than that. It's only 80-something people in there. There's only 5 or 6 women. She's now one of them. if I think in Britain and in America, if we can recognize what she did in the war more, maybe formally, I think that'd be a wonderful thing, because I don't think we knew. But yeah, if telling her wartime story can just give those who follow in her footsteps more reasons to do so, more ammunition, more inspiration, that's a many splendid thing.
Yeah, I agree. And especially in a country like the United States that is so, obsessed with stories about the war. I mean, this is one that, I think would just, will absolutely resonate with people and be instructive. And is something that you're right, they don't know a lot about, in part because also Josephine Baker took a lot of those secrets to her grave, right? I mean, she didn't brag about her service. And that was very
never
common among those kinds of people who served as well. Yeah. Well, it is our tradition as the last question on Chatter that I reach into what I have before me here, the Chatter box, as we call it. And we select one question previously written at random to ask you as our departing question. So I'm going to do that now. This is a very light one, and this is very good for someone who is a world traveler like yourself. This is a nice light to end on. What is your favorite vacation spot? And you've earned a vacation, or you will at the end of your book tour.
That's a bit of a not a trick question, but yeah, well, there is one, but it's my favorite vacation spot simply because. So my father lives in France. In fact, I opened the book talking about that because my father sold our very modest home in Dorset in England, went to France and bought a ruined 14th century chateau, basically with cattle living in it, and spent the next 20 years renovating it. So he lives there. So every summer we pretty much go there and stay there. So for me and my wife and children, that's the constant in our life. We've moved house, we've sold out, we've moved on. We've even lived in different countries, but that is the one place. It's in the Limousin Centre that we keep going back to. So although we've vacationed all over the world, that is the place which we were there this summer. And I said to the kids, look, we keep going back here. We could go anywhere. And they said, no. This is where we come to as a family. This is our anchor. So it's there. It's much more than a vacation spot.
Well, that's wonderful. Well, Damien Lewis, congratulations on the book. Thank you for bringing this part of this extraordinary woman's story to life. It's a great adventure. It's an important story, and we're really grateful that you spent some time with us talking about it.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
That was Chatter, a production of Lawfare and Goat Rodeo. Please subscribe to the podcast and find us on Twitter @ThatWasChatter.